someone had a party tonight and someone reported that this kid had killed their parents.
He told me that the kid up, and he was like, he told me that, like, the gist of it, that he did something to his parents, and I was like, bro, I don't want to know any details. He said he already called and reported everything to Crime Stoppers. I was just calling because I felt like I needed to.
Today's case is absolutely blindsiding. Listen, I've got kids. I have nearly 4. Literally, I'm a few days away from this next one arriving. Hence why I look disheveled and exhausted. But my older boys, because there's been a big gap, 20-year-old, 22-year-old, when I think about the relationship I have with them, and I'm not delusional, and most of you will relate to this, if not all of you relate to this, I know that when it comes down to my protection, they would literally die for me. There is no question whatsoever. They would throw themselves in front of a moving train. Not that I'm demanding that that should happen. And the reality is, I know my relationship with them. Currently, hey, everything can change. I get that. Down the line, some people have incredible relationships with their kids and then they meet a partner and things go toxic and they end up just breaking down in that relationship. But what I'm saying now, right now, the core of my relationship with the kids is that I know they're my protectors. So this case is just horrifying because we're talking about really great parents and how really great parents can give birth to a child who has the very opposite of their interests at heart. And it doesn't matter what they do, it doesn't matter how good they are, it doesn't matter how kind they are, compassionate they are. Because of the egocentricity, because of the antisocial traits of the child they bring into this world, even though they're completely unaware of it, the moment that they bring that baby into this paradigm, they are literally signing their own death warrant. It's just chilling to even be able to say that, let alone tell you a story about it. But that's what we're going to do today, because Tyler Hadley represents everything that I've just said. If you're new to my channel, by the way, I release my content here twice weekly. So if you like crime deep dives, this is the channel for you. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It helps me a lot. If you do find the content interesting, please give me a like. That also helps. And to every single one of you who subscribes to my YouTube membership and Patreon, thank you. Can't do this without you. Can't do any of this without you. So a massive shout out. You can get lots of extra content there if you so wish to. Let's go to the crime that we are talking about today. It actually happens July 16, 2011. And it happens in a really quiet community of Port St. Lucie in Florida. This is basically when a pile of teenagers get together in a suburban family home for what would genuinely become one of the most infamous house parties in true crime history. That's the only way I can describe it. Because what is going to play out that evening when you think that this is just a group of teenagers laying back and having fun is going to turn into something so murderous, so grotesque, that it's such a juxtaposition it's hard to describe. Because every single guest who goes to that party just thinks that the reason they've got an opportunity to let loose and chill out and have fun is because Tyler Hadley's parents are away. And they are away. But they're not out of town, which is the suspicion of those who attend the party. They're not out of town, not visiting someone, they're not hanging out with family and friends elsewhere. The reality is they are no longer in this universe. So let's talk about Tyler Joseph Hadley, who was born on December the 16th, 1993. He's raised in Port St. Lucie in Florida. It's a quiet middle-class community. It's known for its golf courses, gated neighborhoods. So obviously a tranquil environment to grow up, obviously with opportunities as well, because financially people do relatively well there. So he's growing up in a good place and space. His parents were Mary Jo and Blake, and they were both really hardworking people. They had a real interest in giving their children core values and morals. So they're bringing up both Tyler and his older brother Ryan with really strong morals. But I'd say, because both of the parents are very engaged in their children's lives and they're both educated people as well, they do notice early on that Tyler definitely has some kind of emotional and behavioural instability, and that does concern them, and obviously their parents who attend to this. Now bear in mind, his dad, He'd actually been working at a nuclear power plant for 30 years. So obviously a very dedicated, very committed, very consistent individual, to actually have a job like that for 30 years, it shows a credibility about your personality. His mother was an absolutely beloved elementary school teacher, adored by her students. She was described as really patient. She was described as really maternal. Apparently people from the outside looking in said, listen, she was utterly devoted to her children, really devoted. They were actually described by people who knew them as really good people, really good parents. And that's how their older son also describes them. So Ryan said they were amazing parents. And for Ryan, in the very top of this particular conversation that I'm having with you, he's another victim in this case. I cannot even imagine the immeasurable suffering he's been through because of what his brother does. Now, clearly, because of where they're living, because of the great jobs they've got, they're financially stable. They're also a religious household. Their neighbours, I think they're wonderful. They really are good people. And one of the things that was a common denominator that neighbours talked about the family was that the parents were really invested in doing nice things with the kids. So they'd set up the pool in the back garden in the summer for them all to swim in, they'd have barbecues, they'd just hang out together. And there was nothing that felt absolutely alarming about any dynamics in that relationship, which is what makes this case even more shocking. Now, one of the things that I would say separates Ryan, Tyler's older brother, from Tyler is that Ryan really excelled in school. He really excelled in sports as well. And people say that he was kind of considered the golden child. And I understand how that can come across to a child who maybe isn't as successful. Tyler was somebody who did struggle in his brother's shadow. So from an early age, he was quite different. He was smaller in stature. He was quite shy. People said he was quite hypersensitive. And as I say that, I think that so many parents and so many children relate to that situation. We have siblings who parents might seem to favour because they're doing really well in certain areas, but who isn't proud of a child who's shining? But for the child who might not be shining, so if I take my brother and myself, he was shining and I certainly wasn't when I was a kid. I took it really personally that my mum held him with such acclaim and didn't necessarily do the same for me. On reflection, I can see that that's because my actions and behaviours probably were more challenging to manage. So I do see that it causes that sense of abandonment, and certainly Tyler may have been experiencing that as well. Envy, rage, jealousy, because his brother seemed to do things effortlessly. Now, one of the things that I would say in his defence is that people said he was very polite. He was incredibly respectful when he was young. He was somebody who liked football, swimming, skateboarding, just those general childhood traits that we want to see. He was somebody who didn't cause any notable distress in others when he was young. And actually, some neighbours actually trusted him to house sit when they went away for weekends, which you wouldn't do unless you thought that there was a child who was responsible. Another thing that Tyler would do that represents the relationship that he had with his parents, for example, is he'd wait up for his dad to return home from work at the power plant just so they could play basketball together as it got dark. So there's obviously a positive dynamic in Tyler's childhood, in spite of the fact there were some emotional and behavioural issues that the parents are concerned about. Now, it does seem that things start to slide more dramatically when Tyler hits the age of around 10. So at this point, he's displaying self-injurious behaviour. So self-harm behaviour. He'd hit himself, he'd scratch himself, and this is generally in a reaction to emotional stress. Now, lots of people internalise stress, some people externalise it, and some people physicalise it to themselves. So they actually use that kind of scratching, hitting, harming behaviour as a way to externalise the difficult feelings that are building up inside. And whilst it's very alarming to see, it is bizarrely a coping mechanism. It's just one that isn't the most effective in the long term. So he's clearly trying to figure out ways of managing his emotions. He's struggling, but he's trying. One of the things that I think was very difficult for him was he struggled to form relationships and friendships. Socializing was quite difficult for him. So by elementary school, he starts showing signs of emotional and psychological disturbance. So this represents itself in things like frequent crying. He's very socially withdrawn and he has quite irrational fears. Apparently he was very easily frustrated. One of the things that people who knew him said was that he had problems with impulse control. So he was quite a reactive young person. Also, Academically, there are problems. You know, he's rarely completing assignments. Apparently, he had at this point no interest in sports. He wasn't involved in clubs. He didn't have any interest groups. He wasn't involved in school activities. So, on one level, he wants to be involved with peers, and on another, he's rejecting that because he's not getting engaged in areas that will allow him to build those really good relationships. Now, his teachers said that from their perspective, educationally, he seemed very distracted, also quite emotionally vacant. And I find that really interesting, the words emotionally vacant. So a sense that there's nothing going on behind the eyes. There's like a vacancy within him, which is totally a juxtaposition to what we usually see where teenagers are concerned, because understandably they're usually full of emotions as opposed to being vacant of them. They also said when he did engage, it was usually in a defensive way. So he'd use defense mechanisms like sarcasm, dark humor, and people who knew him said there was just this oddness about him. He was strange. And I think that when we look back at our childhoods, we can often pick out kids that we just gave a wide berth. We don't know why. They hadn't necessarily done anything horrible to us. It's just that there is something about the aura that they're giving off that makes us feel like we don't want to be connected to them. And that's an instinctual survival reaction. And it's challenging because, you know, the kid gets left by themselves and you avoid the kid, and that doesn't always sit well with you. But the reality is that survival mechanism is incredibly important in human nature. It's why we survive situations, because we read into it and think that person isn't safe. Now, one of the things that friends, family, people who are kind of relatively close to Tyler said was that in his early years, what stood out about him was he really struggled with any kind of setback. So if somebody criticized him, if something went wrong, he didn't know how to manifest coping. So he would become completely broken down by it. If he got minor criticism, he'd be explosive in response, or he'd just withdraw completely. Now that tells you that he's not able to interpret cues in the way that you and I would. Because for the most part, it is horrible being criticized. No one likes to be criticized, right? But we also appreciate that in life, everybody's got an opinion. It's as simple as that. So you have to get used to it. Their criticism doesn't necessarily have to speak truth. And if their criticism does speak truth, well, actually, that's quite helpful because you can adapt and adjust and recalibrate so that you go down the right path. But to not be able to even hear the tiniest criticism, that's deeply problematic, because criticism is emblematic of our human experience, isn't it? It happens all the time. I mean, we live in an age of judgment. And for young people, it's even more of a judgmental environment. So he's struggling on a regular basis, and apparently his mood swings are super, super unpredictable. And at this point, his behavior does start becoming a real concern, and it gets worse as he enters adolescence. Of course it does, because when you enter adolescence, you've got the peer relationships issue, you've got the pressures from school, you've got the hormonal changes, you've got your physical shifts, you've got your sexual awakening. You've just got this whole cacophony and absolute collision, and dramatic changes that happen during this period of time, all coming together at once, and no one's telling you how to cope with it, because actually most of us didn't really know how to cope with it ourselves when we went through it. So we already know there's almost this like cataclysmic journey that's occurring for Tyler because of the fact that he's going through these shifts and changes whilst also having these unresolved emotional and behavioural issues. Now, the interviews that have been done around Tyler's friends after the crime that I'm going to talk about plays out, they actually talk about the fact there were multiple instances where he was making threats of violence, he'd joke about murder, or he'd show absolutely no remorse for destructive acts. Now, of course, let's be real here. Who doesn't, in our sphere, with our mindsets and our interests, because I know that you guys and I are all the same in that respect, yes, we do joke about things like where to hide bodies and carrying out the perfect murder. And actually, I set people on fire in my head quite a lot. But the point is, I would never carry those actions out. That is very distinct from what I'm talking about here. So Tyler, when he talks about these things, there's something about the conversations that remain with his friends. And the reason for that is it will probably be that when they listen to him, it feels more than just jokes. It feels like fantasy potentially, or even a desire for action around these things. And like I said, it's fine to joke about murder. It's fine to joke about threats of violence. But when it comes down to actually doing destructive acts and then you show no remorse, we have a big problem. Because without remorse, there's no accountability, there's no responsibility, there's no restraint. And that means that consequence is going to have no impact on you. Now, bear in mind, whilst all this is playing out and he's going through his confusion and people are a little bit concerned about him, his parents are always on his side. They see him as a really good kid. They believe he's got no bad intentions, but they do note that there is this steady decline in his behaviour. Also, when he hits teenagehood, he gets into a crowd which I suppose would archetypally be considered the bad crowd. He starts engaging in heavy drug use, which is obviously going to really perpetuate any of his emotional issues. And there's an example that they gave, which is when he and his friends actually dragged a sofa they found in a wildlife park and they set it on fire. Now, they got caught for that. That got them a warning from the authorities. And we all know, McDonald triad, at the end of the day, arson is one of those triad points. So when we see people setting fire to things as kids, it's always a bit of a red flag. Another time, he's caught breaking into someone's house, attempting to commit burglary, which is obviously a big deal. I mean, that is a complete boundary shift and break. For the average young person, doesn't matter who you're hanging around with, the idea of going and breaking and entering and stealing from somebody's home just doesn't even cross your mind. And if somebody was thinking about doing it, the likelihood is you would say, that's a really bad idea, let's not do that. But he goes ahead and tries. And there's another account given as well, which involves him urinating all over his friend's bed. Now, obviously, this will have been when he was drunk or high, but again, it's just such a boundary breach. It's highly inappropriate behaviour. And yes, I know some of you will be like, I did that once, but there is something about the consistency in this guy's behaviour that is obviously causing alarm bells to ring. Now, he ends up getting arrested for stealing and vandalising property. He also, one time, burns his friend's mailbox as a prank, which is not funny because it's not your friend's mailbox. It's their parents' mailbox. So again, impulse control is low, boundaries are poor, consequences are not cared for. Also, when he's in school, people said he'd just make up lies all the time. He'd say that his parents were his real ones, that his dad abuses him. And that in itself is such a breach of trust. I mean, people exaggerate when they're young. People make stories up to make themselves more interesting when they are young. But the idea that you would tell people at school that your father was abusing you, which is an out and out lie, that is so dangerous for the family stability, for his father's job. And the consequences can be dire in those situations, but he goes ahead and does it because it gives him attention. Now, his behaviour obviously is raising red flags at this point. His mother's really concerned about him. So she decides, because of the drug use, she wants to send him on a substance abuse program. She just wants to help him heal, get him the help he needs. And she said to them at that period of time that she was not scared of him at all, but she was worried about him hurting himself. So she's not concerned for her own safety, but she does fear for his safety. Now, she's going to get that wrong in the most tragic of ways, but you can see that she's fully committed to her child and changing his mindset for the better. Now, there's a particularly disturbing incident that I found out about Tyler, which is really awful. His friend actually said he found a turtle and he tried to smash it with a brick, like just for fun. Now, again, talking about the McDonald triads, what do we expect to see? We expect to see animal torture, arson, and actually bedwetting. Arguably, he's kind of got all three of those because he's wet his friend's bed, if not his own. And when we see those all together, because they're rare all together, it's the future indicator of violent behaviour. Like I said, he's ticking all the boxes, and wow, he is going to absolutely fall into that paradigm of future violent behaviour. Now, during this period of time with the drugs, the alcohol, the hanging out with the wrong crowd, the disengaging with his education, his mental health starts to significantly deteriorate. At this point, he was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and also possible bipolar tendencies. They then placed him on psychiatric medications. These included Prozac, Lexapro, Seroquel. Now, for some people, these medications can be really life-changing. Certainly my experience when I was a young person and they put me on Prozac, I literally did 3 weeks and then thought I want to throw myself off a bridge and never went back down that path ever again, because they affect and impact everybody very, very differently. So essentially, he doesn't like the impact. Their effectiveness was inconsistent for him, and at times he refused to take them. Now, in conversations that were later recovered from text messages and online chats, one of the things that Tyler frequently spoke of was just feeling really empty or numb, feeling like nothing matters, he said. So he basically expressed a lot of nihilistic beliefs. So nihilistic beliefs, just for those of you who might not understand that particular definition, they center around the idea that life is inherently meaningless and that traditional values and beliefs are unfounded. It kind of leads to this persistent state of hopelessness. Often people with nihilistic beliefs will start making references to death or suicide or wanting to disappear. And he definitely embodies that. But the thing is, he's a kid and he's hanging out with other kids. And young people aren't equipped to deal with that absolutely enormous burden. So they don't really take it seriously. It's as simple as that. And I think most of us can relate to that, where we've had friends when we're younger and they're going through a really bad time. And you're just thinking to yourself, it'll be fine, you'll be fine. And even if they're talking about things that seem really dark, the assumption and bias is that my friend will be okay. And whilst these things don't always turn out okay, it's completely relatable that friends don't take him seriously. In fact, one friend reported that Tyler had once said, "If I killed my parents, would I still get caught if I threw a huge party afterward?" And that friend said, at the time, I just dismissed it as being some kind of sarcastic comment. But it's chilling in reality because of what we're going to talk about regarding what plays out in this crime. Also, the fact that he's actually talking about very specific events, like having a party after killing his parents. It's not that people won't joke about wanting the parents dead, for example, but to actually say, questioning wise, would it be okay for me to have a party afterwards? There just seems something a little bit deeper about the thought process there. Now, his parents, in April 2011, they actually do start, shall I say, pushing more strict boundaries on him. Very fair boundaries, but the reason for this is he gets involved in a violent altercation at a friend's house. The police end up getting called. He gets charged with aggravated battery. So the parents are now dealing with somebody who's got these criminal charges against him. He's placed on house arrest. At this point, his parents take the phone away because they want to punish him and give him some boundaries. He's angry. He's really angry by this because, he's entitled and he believes that life is already against him, and now they are compounding this by removing his social life, essentially taking his phone away. So at this point, there's a mental shift psychologically where he stops viewing his parents as carers and he starts seeing them as jailers. Now, in the weeks that lead up to the horrific crime that we're going to talk about, he actually tells one of his friends that his parents had ruined his life and that they were the reason that he couldn't do anything. Now, we've all had those conversations with our friends. There's nothing untoward about saying this stuff. I can clearly remember not being allowed to go to the rugby club do with my boyfriend when I was like 16 because I'd had a row with my mother and my dad preventing me going. And I literally thought, well, that's it. My life is over and you don't deserve to exist anymore. You're very reactive, you're very emotional, and things are very big. So it's not unusual for kids to say, I can't do anything to ruin my life. This is completely contextual. So again, the friend would just hear that normally. And oftentimes when Tyler would actually fall out and argue with his parents, he would be very, very rageful. So he'd have no problem expressing his rage and resentment in that moment. But after he'd actually let that all out, apparently he'd be very guilty immediately after he'd apologise. So I'll take you to an event in May. So this is just before the tragic events unfold. He argues with his mum, but he tells her to shut up and then immediately apologises afterwards because he realises that that's inappropriate. So again, there is a dichotomy here because what we're talking about is somebody with very high levels of antisocial behaviour and traits, personality-wise. And yet he also at points shows to have some kind of conscience, such as when he's in an argument with his mother and he says something that's out of order and immediately recalibrates and apologises for it. And he actually went on to speak to his friends about that particular altercation and said he was really upset because his mother was really sad because obviously they were getting into rows, and also he'd been put on house arrest that she was very ashamed of. So he definitely felt feelings. It isn't as if this guy is completely devoid of understanding impact, which is intriguing when we actually look at what plays out in the horrific murders I'm going to describe. Now, in July, he'd actually spoken to a friend about how he'd really enjoyed Mother's Day, for example. He and his elder brother, they'd taken the mum out for the day, they'd had food, and he described it to friends as a really nice day. And then 2 weeks before the murders of his parents, his mother basically is talking to her friends about the fact that she feels like she's getting the old Tyler back, that he's getting better. She's happy about this. She wants the best for him. And I guess there is a saying that really comes to mind in that moment, which is the lull before the storm. It's something that really connects, this period of quiet and calm and connection before the absolute explosion and implosion of the lives of Tyler's parents and his own future. And I think that if you look at this psychologically, when you consider decisions, they can be a real mood lifter. So we can wander around and think about wanting to do something, and then we make a decision ultimately to or not to do it, and the burden is lifted. There is a saying that thought is the enemy of action. So once you transmute the thoughts into action, things become easier. Now, it can work very positively, or it can work really negatively. In this case, is it that he's come to a conclusion, well, I actually know what I'm going to do. So I've got this relief because I've made a decision. The doing is going to become effortless because of that. I'm going to go ahead and go through with the plan that I've been fantasizing about. It could be that's why his mood is lifted. That's why he's nicer to his parents, because ultimately he knows that he's going to go ahead and do exactly what he's been planning for a long time. Now, what we know is in the events that lead up to the murders, this is the week before the murders, Tyler has started to plan a party. He wants to throw a big party. And he basically goes around telling people at school there's going to be this big party on. And it's weird for the kids because he isn't really engaged in peer networks. He isn't very popular. He isn't somebody who has a family that are massively open to letting loose and being free in their home. So when he's asking people to come to his party, it's a bit disconcerting for the kids. In fact, they didn't believe him, first of all. He'd never done it before, and he's also seen as quite an introvert who's withdrawn. So this was really strange. And that's not just because we know that Tyler's already grounded, but it's because he's reportedly told people that his parents are being super strict at the moment. They're not letting him out of the house. They've banned him from his phone, etc. And when they ask him, okay, so how are you going to throw a party when your parents are putting all these restrictions on you? Tyler just replied, they won't be there. And actually, even up until the day of the party, people are texting him saying, are your parents definitely going to be away? And he basically says, well, they're not yet, but they'll be leaving soon. Now, as these messages are being sent to and forth, he also, around 1:15 p.m, posts to Facebook, party at my crib, maybe. Now, of course, that isn't confirmed, so people are going to be waiting to figure out, is there going to be a party around his or not? But also, does it mean during that space and time where he's putting it out there, he's starting to commit to the idea that he's been fantasizing about for a period of time? And then later he does confirm on Facebook that the party's going ahead. He writes, it's time. Now, at this point, one of his very sensible friends, this would have been me as a kid, because I never wanted to get into trouble with anybody else's parents. I think it was the time period that I grew up in, like none of my kids' friends are scared of me. Literally. My kids' friends would never find me scary, even if I was trying to be. We've changed our relationships with kids, and I think that's great. When I grew up, literally, people's parents were scary. I had one friend whose parents, actually that's the line. I had two friends whose parents were like cool. When I say cool, they were just naughty. It was just that I could get away with mischief. That's the reality, but I thought they were amazing because of that. Everybody else's parents, terrified. You used to knock on the door. For young people watching this, you'd be like, what? What are you doing? What are you doing? We've got mobile phones, we've got technology, we organise things online, and then we never let down. Whereas in my day, They didn't exist, did they? So you would go around, you would knock on a door, and a parent would answer you, you'd be like, is Pam there? Is Pam in? Can I play out with Pam? Like even at like 12, you'd be doing that. That was the language you used. And you'd call them Mr. or Mrs. You know, Mr. Fairhurst, can I see Pam? And Mr. Fairhurst would be like, Pam's eating her dinner, so she can come out after dinner. Just want to wait outside. And you just sit on a wall outside your friend's house until the kid came out to play with you. You wouldn't question it. You were terrified of the parents. So I'd be the kid texting him going, are you sure that we're not going to get caught? Just clarify that we're not going to have your parents walking in and making us feel really uneasy, stroke, in trouble. So he writes back, trust me, they won't. And there's something really ominous about that text because of what actually happens. Now, on the morning of Saturday, July 16, 2011, Tyler began, I suppose how we would describe it, is preparing for what he'd already decided would be the last day of his parents' lives. He'd been fantasizing about killing his parents for weeks, possibly months, with respect. And the now 17-year-old Tyler chooses that Saturday as the day. Now, investigators who dug deep into this case, they found that Tyler had withdrawn money from his parents' bank account. He'd hid their phones because he didn't want any emergency calls happening. He retrieved a 22-ounce framing claw hammer from the garage, which I put a picture up because it is terrifying. And it is horrifying to imagine that when you think about how you're going to kill somebody, and obviously we're not doing that on a day-to-day basis, but let's just put ourselves in the mindset of a killer. There is something so brutal about a claw hammer, particularly when it's at a juxtaposition to the relationship that you have with the people who absolutely love you. And you're thinking about this brutal, dehumanizing, disfiguring, violent way of killing them. But that's going to be the murder weapon. Now, unlike a typical claw hammer, a framing hammer, it's heavier, it's longer, and it is absolutely capable of delivering lethal force with a single blow. His next step was to take 3 ecstasy pills. So he obviously wants to feel in a different state of consciousness when he's carrying out these killings. Now, first, he goes to his unsuspecting mother. She's just sitting at the family computer. He actually reportedly stood behind her for 5 minutes, just thinking about what to do. And she didn't know he was there. She didn't realize that her son, now her killer-to-be, is just behind her, armed with this brutal weapon. He lifts the claw end of the hammer above her head and then he beats her skull with it repeatedly. And her last words apparently were, why, Tyler? Why are you doing this? Can you imagine the trauma, the fear, the confusion, the shock that she endures in those moments? Why, Tyler? Why are you doing this? It makes perfect sense because she can't compute that her child would want her dead. Tyler later told the police that he didn't respond, he just carried on the assault. Now, Mary Jo fought back. She tried to shield herself with her hands and her arms, and her autopsy revealed that she had multiple defense wounds. She had severe blunt force trauma to the head and face, and her skull was also fractured in several places. Tyler just continued striking her until she stopped moving. He wanted to make sure that she was absolutely dead. Blood literally splattered the walls, the floor, the doorway. Now, understandably, Tyler's father has heard his wife scream. He runs in to see what's happening, and his final moments must just have been filled with utter shock. Witnessing his own son killing his own mother. Tyler and his father apparently had eye contact and held the eye contact, and his father said, "Why would you do this?" Tyler replied, "Why the fuck not?" According to Tyler, his father did actually try to land a few punches. He did manage a couple of them, and the whole point of this was he wanted to overpower his son and help his wife. Bear in mind, Tyler is not a big guy, and his father's around 6'1" and 300 pounds, so that's huge compared to Tyler. But Tyler is fueled with adrenaline, drugs, sadistic aggression, a weapon. And that means that in spite of that difference between them, he manages to overpower his father. They struggle, and then they move towards the hallway in that struggle, then the bedroom in that struggle. And at this point, Blake is just repeatedly struck in the head neck and the chest. The autopsy revealed that Blake had suffered over a dozen distinct hammer blows. This included several crushing injuries to the skull and face. He also had defensive wounds on his hands and arms. And Tyler, whilst he's beating his own dad, his innocent father, his loving father to death, he's screaming, "Why the fuck not?" Now, I appreciate he was under the influence of drugs. And I appreciate that on drugs like ecstasy, people get into loops where they just say the same things and act in the same way and get hooked on the same thought process. So it could be that that plays into it. But it also suggests that he's just kind of been ready and he's got all of this anger and resentment and he's just letting it out in that moment. Now, his next step, literally after brutally murdering these loving parents, is to drag both of their bodies into the master bedroom. He lies them face down, side by side. He puts the murder weapon in between them, quite ritualistic in my mind. He then covers them with towels, clothing, bedding. And on top of their bodies, he stacks a coffee table, a pile of family photographs, several file boxes and books. It kind of looked like a makeshift shrine of household items. It's very bizarre. But again, he's on drugs and also he probably wants to disassociate and disconnect from the actions. So covering them up and trying to hide them is a very emotionally unstable way of responding to that because you're not confronting it, you're denying it, even though you're the perpetrator of the actions. And it shows an emotional immaturity because, of course, you can't change what's occurred. And it's a little bit like when you're a kid and you think there's a monster in the room and you put the covers over your head. It's not going to make a difference if there is indeed a monster in the room. But in that moment, you feel like you've disconnected from the fear and protected yourself. So certainly that seems to play into those actions. Now, Tyler, of course, has got a real mess on his hands because there is blood literally everywhere. So he spends the next 3 hours scrubbing blood, mopping floors, loading blood-soaked towels and clothes into the washing machine, and obviously hiding as much evidence as possible. When you're going to have a big party, you don't want people coming in and seeing things that are incriminating. That's going to really kill the vibe. He actually said that he was shocked at how long it took him to clear up. Well, when people have bled out, it's very difficult to clean those kind of areas, and he struggles with it because there's so much blood. He also makes another post on Facebook about the party after he's done this, and he then tells investigators when they're talking to him about this crime that after he'd finished cleaning, he just looked at himself in the mirror for a matter of minutes and laughed because it's so funny. Now, there is a part of me on the professional psychological level where I can think to myself, he looks at himself in the mirror directly and laughs. Is that more to do with an absolute surprise and shock at his actions? It could potentially be. It could be less malice and more surprise informed. That's why he's looking at himself and laughing so hysterically because he didn't think he was really going to go through with it. It doesn't diminish the actions, but it means that there is this, again, disconnect between actions and consequence. Now, at this point, he thinks to himself, well, I'm going to need a bit of cash, aren't I? He goes, uses his parents' cards and withdraws $5,000 from his parents' account. Then he goes and picks up his mates, brings them back to the home. And of course, you know how it is online these days. If somebody's got a party going on, you put it online, it's going to spread like wildfire, even in quite a small middle-class area. So between 60 and 100 people end up coming to the party. Now, most of them don't actually know Tyler at all on a personal level, but it's just a place to hang out, isn't it? People who came to that party said from the get-go, he just acted really strangely. He actually told people there was a rule of no smoking inside as it was his parents' house. I bet that was successful, Tyler. I bet they were all like, well, of course, we would never smoke. Are we not allowed alcohol either? Let's talk about that too. Let's get the boundaries and the rules right. I mean, you know, you have a house party with loads of kids that you don't really know. You're going to get fag burns everywhere for a start. But it is like a typical teenage party. They put beer pong set up on the table. People are sat around the sofas. There's literally beer cans and bottles everywhere. Now, according to witnesses, when they arrive, because we are so deeply instinctual, there's something about the house that these kids feel doesn't feel right. So first of all, the air conditioning wasn't on. Now, it's really hot outside, so that doesn't make sense. There's a strange smell. People said it was like a mix of cleaning chemicals, sweat, and something they couldn't place. I think we all know what that will be. In fact, somebody made a comment that it was like a dead rat or a wet dog, but worse. Now, all the bedroom doors were locked. One could say, well, that's a positive thing to do when you're throwing a party. You don't want some stranger in your bed. But there's just something that feels a little bit strange about the setup. And the master bedroom, which is obviously where he's put his parents' bodies, that's locked as well. Bear in mind, the family usually have a pristine home, but it's messy. Furniture's been moved, framed photographs were missing from the walls, there were towels piled in the hallway, and so it's just an unusual setup. But again, kids want to go and party, they want to have fun with the mates, so it doesn't deter them from being there. Now, around 2 a.m, the police end up knocking on the door of the home because there's been a noise complaint. Standard, we've all been there in that situation. But nothing actually stemmed from this. They left, things were sorted. But people did begin noticing, whilst they're playing things like beer pong, that there's red stains in various areas of the home. There's red stains around the computer, there's red stains on the furniture. And one attendee actually said that when they were playing beer pong, the ball rolled under a table and it rolled in what they thought was a pool of blood. But even though it looked like blood, they didn't believe it possibly could be. They just thought it must be something else. And that's the way that our brain works, isn't it? In those moments where you find out something really heinous, you want to kind of make it okay. So you just legitimize that it'll be something else. Now, Tyler, during this party, is just drifting from group to group. He wants to keep the energy up, but people who were talking to him said that just something felt off about him. So he was constantly pacing, he was biting his nails, he was frequently apparently disappearing into the master bedroom, which was locked to everyone else. And also he kept mentioning to people that his parents weren't home. Now, when one person, a girl, asked where his parents were, Tyler said, oh, they're in Orlando. Another guest actually made a joke about the mess, and Tyler smiled and said, you won't believe what I had to do to throw this party. Now, that is dark humour, but it's incredibly malevolent when you consider the facts of this case. At some point during the party, Tyler actually pulls one of his friends over for a chat and says, I killed someone. Now, his friend said, I didn't believe him, but I didn't want to know anymore. I didn't want to even take a chance that there could be any truth in this conversation. So I said to him, I don't want to know. So he kind of withdrew from that conversation. Now, Tyler then pulls aside one of his closest friends, a kid called Michael Mandel, and he says, let's go for a walk. So they end up at this point in the garage. Now, Tyler apparently looked him in the eye and said, I killed my parents. Now, understandably, his friend didn't believe him, but Tyler is absolutely insistent. He said, if you take a look around, you'll see, because obviously there's blood and notable issues in the home. Now, at this point, his friend starts to piece together the fact that there is this smell, that Tyler's acting really weird, and that there are stains that look like blood. And at this point, he actually says to his friend, I'll take you to see. So he takes Mandel to the locked master bedroom. He gets the key from his pocket, he unlocks the door, and he shows his friend, his close friend, the bodies of his parents. And for this young man, he's looking at this scene. He's also seeing the smears of blood on the floor and around the room. It must have been so breathtakingly panic-inducing, but he holds his nerve. Whilst Tyler describes how he'd killed his parents, how he'd taken the ecstasy tablets, how he'd cleaned it all up, he just allows him to confess. And in the end, he actually says to his friend, I couldn't throw the party if they were here. Now, Mandel does a really good job because he's obviously worried about reality. There are murders that have taken place. He's worried about his friend's safety because he's concerned that he might do something to himself. And he doesn't want to create an alarmist situation where the police and authorities cannot be informed without it being that Tyler tries to leave or vacate the area. So he wants to manage this situation. I think that's incredibly brave and also very astute of him. So he stays at the party for another hour. He's just at this point trying to process what he's seen and also is thinking about what he needs to do next. So at one point he even takes a selfie with Tyler because he thinks it's going to be the last time he's going to see him because he's either going to kill himself or be arrested. So he's got all these conflicting feelings going on and like he's desperate to make sure his friend is protected but equally is brought to justice. Now, he leaves the house around 2 a.m. and he calls Crime Stoppers, reports his best friend, gives them an anonymous tip. He also takes Tyler's extra drugs because he's genuinely concerned that Tyler might kill himself. Now, people have questioned why he stayed with Tyler after he found out about this situation. And he said, if you were in my shoes and that guy was your best friend, you wouldn't want to leave right away. I know how heinous and sick this is, but you wouldn't have run because you're comfortable with this guy. And also, I completely validate what he's saying because he has the information. He wants to make sure that that information gets to the authorities, but he's also aware that there's a cooking pot of possibility where Tyler's emotions are concerned. It could become dangerous again. So it's better to temper that possibility and to just seem cool with everything. And it's really sad because that particular individual had quite a hard life afterwards. He was known for basically being best friends with a murderer, and his school and social life really suffered because of that. Now, because of that tip-off, the police arrive at the Hadley residence just after the early hours of Sunday, July the 17th, 2011. It's about 4:30 a.m. Now, before they even knock on the door, they can see through the window that Tyler's pacing up and down the living room. He's taking armfuls of books off the shelf. He's going, of course, back to the master bedroom to pile them up on top of his parents' bodies. And actually, minutes before doing that, he's been back on Facebook again, trying to get people to come back to the party. So again, deflection, just trying to disassociate from reality. Now, at this point, everyone had genuinely left. It had only been his best friend who he'd confessed to that had managed to stay till the end of the party. Now they'd gone. So he's just desperate for people to come back. He wants the party to carry on because he doesn't want to have to confront reality. So he answers the door. Bear in mind, the police kind of find him quite pale, quite quiet. And the police said he was dazed, but he was also cooperative. Now, when they ask him, are your parents in or out? Tyler responds that they're out of town in Orlando. But the officers are already really suspicious. The house smells strongly of cleaning products. It also smells of decomposition, and the interior is a complete state. The officers move really quickly. They do a protective sweep of the house. In the living room, they find empty beer bottles, overturned furniture. Also, they find a really sticky residue on the floor. In the kitchen, there's blood spatters seen near the entrance to the hallway. The master bedroom door is locked, so when police are asked for the key, Tyler basically claims he doesn't have it. Now, eventually, they do manage to retrieve the key. They enter the bedroom, and of course, they find the deceased parents of Tyler underneath the pile of household items, which must have been just absolutely horrifying for them. They could see just by looking at his parents that they'd been killed through blunt force trauma. They had extensive head and facial trauma, and it's ruled at this point, of course, a double homicide. Now, Tyler is immediately placed under arrest. He's read his Miranda rights, and officers said during this period of time he was really calm, he was silent, he was also showing emotional flat affect during the process. There was no resistance, there was no panic, he didn't attempt to flee. And I suppose that disturbing lack of remorse and a lack of emotional recognition of what he'd done kind of becomes central to this case. You know, the psychological profile that's done on him later and used in court is something that kind of demonstrates just how disassociated this young man is from reality. And I don't mean in a psychotic way, I mean in a personality traits way. Now, he does give a brief confession when he gets to the police station, tells them that he'd taken 3 ecstasy pills, then he tried to numb himself with that, tells them he killed his mother first and his father, talked about the cleaning of the house, the hiding of the bodies, and then, of course, hosting the bizarre party afterwards. He said, I didn't want them to be mad at me for having a party. Now, that is totally psychopathic, isn't it? The short-term reward over the long-term impact. He wants to do something. He's thought of a way to create that possibility, and he will kill if he has to achieve that goal. That is how a psychopath works. They are devoid of the conscience, they're devoid of the empathy, and actually they're devoid in the long term of those consequential thoughts that protect them from these kind of actions. And it just really resonates that he said that to the officers. Now, Tyler Hadley was booked into St. Lucie County Jail on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Bear in mind, he's 17, so initially there was a debate over whether he would be charged as a juvenile or an adult, but given the brutality of the crime, given the premeditated nature of the killings, the prosecutors announced within 48 hours that Tyler Hadley would be tried as an adult. So at this point, he is held without bail pending trial. Now, when it came down to the crime scene investigators, they spent nearly 2 full days processing the Hadley home. The key forensic findings included blunt force trauma as the cause of death for both Blake and Mary Jo Hadley, blood spatter evidence throughout the master bedroom, the hallway, and the computer room, which indicated the sequence of attacks. Of course, they found the weapon, the 22-ounce framing hammer, because that was between the bodies. That was, of course, confirmed to be the murder weapon. The DNA analysis revealed it was literally coated with both victims' blood. It had traces of Tyler's fingerprints on it. Also, they found blood stains on the laundry baskets, towels, flooring. That all suggests that Tyler had made a partial but really kind of unsophisticated attempt to clean up. They found drag marks, which obviously indicated both the victims had been moved post-mortem from the original point of attack into the master bedroom. And in total, the physical evidence pointed to a really premeditated, methodical, planned killing, followed by a real deliberate effort to stage the scene for a party, which is just beyond gruesome. Also, when they analysed his computer, they found searches like how to get away with murder, what happens if you kill your parents, and can you throw a party after committing a crime? They are bizarre and yet very relevant and incredibly incriminating. Now, detectives interviewed over 40 individuals who attended the party or had communicated with Tyler in the weeks leading up to the murders. Multiple friends admitted that Tyler had joked about killing his parents in the days prior. One said he'd heard it so often, quote, it didn't even seem like a big deal anymore. He'd say things like, I want to do something crazy, something people will never forget. And so people are hearing this, but not taking it seriously, which is what happens in life constantly, because we believe the best in people on the whole, not the worst. Now, several guests, they also responded to officers about the locked master bedroom. They said that things smell awful. His demeanour was really strange that night. So on reflection, it adds up that something really untoward had played out, and they were kind of aware of it, but they didn't want to confront it. Now, understandably, Tyler was subjected to a psychological evaluation whilst he's in juvenile custody. Now, the reports suggested he showed signs of depression, antisocial behaviour, and also a potential personality disorder. I think we can all agree, antisocial personality disorder, with respect. Now, he is found legally competent to stand trial, so he's not showing any signs of psychosis or mental incompetence. And the investigators had reported that he understood the consequences of actions. He just didn't care about them at the time. Now, the investigation ultimately concluded that Tyler Hadley murdered his parents to firstly remove restrictions on his behaviour, to throw a party and gain social notoriety and status, to become infamous for what he did. In fact, they said Tyler didn't kill because he was angry, he killed because he could. Now, on February the 20th, 2014, this is more than 2.5 years after the murders, Tyler Hadley pled no contest to 2 counts of first-degree murder. In his plea, he agreed that he had planned the murders in advance, he'd waited until he was alone with his parents, and he'd killed both Mary Jo and Blake Hadley using a hammer. He also admitted that he had hosted a party afterwards whilst their bodies lay hidden in the bedroom, and at this point, understandably, because he pled guilty, he was indeed sentenced, and that sentence was 2 concurrent life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge actually said, these were the ultimate acts of betrayal, committed not by a stranger, not by an enemy, but by their own flesh and blood. During his sentencing, Tyler actually wrote a letter to his grandparents saying this: I was just living my life as a normal 17-year-old kid. Next thing I know, I'm in the middle of St. Lucie County Jail. I ruined a lot of people's lives and I can't seem to forgive myself. I find myself crying a lot because of all the guilt. Every day I ask God for forgiveness and I beg him not to send me to hell. I'm extremely nervous that I'm going to get a life sentence. I'm really sorry for all the grief I've stirred up. I know Everyone thinks I'm a psychopath and all, but I'm really sorry for everything. I feel extremely bad for Ryan, and especially you and my other grandparents for the grief I've caused. I'm scared and I feel so alone. Yeah, well, don't kill your parents brutally then. It's not going to make you popular with the wider family, is it? He also said to a friend, I wish I could throw back some Miller Lights and smoke a fat-ass strawberry white owl, but I gotta say, it feels good to be sober. I swear to you, Michael, the devil had a hold on me. I'm not a cold-blooded monster. I'm a caring person that made a horrible mistake. I appreciate your sentiments there, Tyler, but I'm not that convinced we're all buying into that. Sounds a lot like you're saying, please feel sorry for me, and I really do miss having the odd drink, but now I'm sober because I've no choice. I'm just accepting that I'm a better person without being high and murdering people. Just throwing it out there. Not sure that we feel that you're that remorseful. He also said to his friend that he knew his parents loved him even as he was beating them to death. That's the worst part about this, isn't it? Because he'll be absolutely correct, 100% correct. His parents loved him right until that final blow when their life was snuffed out. The big question for them in those final seconds was, why? Because they'd done absolutely nothing to invite that kind of horror. One of the things that makes me feel that he genuinely isn't remorseful is during his time initially in jail before he was sentenced, he bragged about what he'd done. He bragged about what an awesome party it was, even though people thought it was weird and smelled of decomposition and there were bloodstains all over the carpet. Apparently, Tyler had a right old good time. And also, he would sign autographs with its hammer time or as Hambo, because he felt that that came from inspiration of the murder weapon. So he sounds entirely sorry, doesn't he? It's just what we expect when people are really sorry, to actually be really remorseful and regretful and then to name themselves the nickname of the actual murder weapon, Hambo. Just call me Hambo. That's how I brutalised and murdered my parents. But I'm really sorry about it and I'd love to have a Miller Lite. Really annoying. Now, in 2016, Tyler Hadley's case resurfaced, and the reason for that is that in the US, there was a major change. So the US Supreme Court ruling said that when you have a young offender who is held on a mandatory life sentence without parole, you have to review that. They said it was unconstitutional without consideration of mitigating factors like age, maturity, and background. So his prison time did stay the same, but he was made eligible for parole. So he is currently serving his sentence at the Okeechobee Correctional Institution in Florida. He might be there for the rest of his life. Who knows? He might get out because they might agree a parole maybe in 25 years. Now, understandably, the community was absolutely devastated by the loss of Blake and Mary Jo. They held the funeral on the 23rd of July 2011. That was just 6 days after their murders. It took place at the Holy Family Catholic Church in Port St. Lucie. The church was absolutely packed with friends, with co-workers, with neighbours, with members of the shocked community. And at the front of the church, two closed caskets sat side by side. When they were talking about this couple, it was noted this was not just a tragedy. It was a betrayal of everything they stood for. They lived for that boy. Mary Jo was remembered as this really sweet and giving woman who was just devoted to a life for caring for others. Blake Hadley, who had become a watch engineer after working at the nuclear power plant, he was described as a quiet man with a kind heart who worked incredibly hard to give his son a better life. And when family members were actually asked about the events, they said, it's like a bomb went off in our family and we're still living in the ruins. We raised Tyler like our own child. We spoiled him, loved him, and he destroyed our lives. That was Tyler's grandma. Family members actually refused to visit Tyler in jail, and many said, we'll never forgive him, which I completely understand. Now, Tyler's brother is a pretty remarkable young man. After the funeral, he actually drove over to go and see Tyler. When asked why, he said, it's what my parents would want me to do. They wouldn't want me to abandon him. I don't know what I'm going to say. I'll probably just sit there and cry. Now, I don't know whether Ryan still visits his brother, but it shows an unbelievable level of compassion in that young man's heart. When you think about the horror that he's endured, the loss he's endured, the life that's been stolen from him with his parents, when he has children, gets married and so on and so forth, it's all been taken by his brother. And yet after the funeral, he was concerned about his brother because he knew his parents would be concerned about his brother. What a juxtaposition in these brothers. One full of compassion, love, empathy, also responsibility, and the other essentially free of all those. So free, in fact, that he was willing, for the sake of a party, to murder the people who raised him, who loved him, and who protected him. It's astonishing to me, astonishing, that this young man chose to murder two people who adored him, who did the best for him, who worked hard for him, who lived for him. And the consequence of them living for him that way was ultimately losing their lives to this man. Whether he'll ever get out, I don't know. Do you think he should? Do you believe that he deserves parole? Do you believe that he could change? Or do you believe that that stone cold psychopath exists within him and he'll always be a danger? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, guys. As ever, I'll see you again next time. Look after yourselves. Be safe.